A king built his throne on blood and silence. He crushed every rebel, burned every name that dared challenge his reign. But the one enemy he could never defeat was the truth he buried with his own hands. Tonight, a condemned man kneels in chains, and the secret he carries could shatter an empire. Stay with me until the very end, because this story will cut deeper than any blade. If you're watching right now, drop a like and tell me, what city are you in? Let your people know you're part of this tribe. The boy had not stopped shaking since they dragged him through the gate. He was small for his age, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dirt caked into the hollows of his cheeks and fingernails black with soil. His clothes were patched so many times the original fabric had become a ghost of itself, and his boots were split along the soles so that his bare toes scraped the cobblestones every time a guard shoved him forward. He did not cry. That was the thing the soldiers noticed first. A child hauled through the iron gates of Voss Keep at midnight, surrounded by armed men twice his height, and not a single tear fell from those wide, dark eyes. The courtyard smelled of torch smoke and horse dung. Rain from earlier in the evening had turned the stone floor into a shallow mirror, and the boy's reflection shivered beneath him every time the wind moved the torchlight. His wrists were bound with rope too thick for his frame, the kind they used on livestock, and the fibers had already rubbed the skin raw enough to bleed. 3 paces ahead, a man walked in heavier chains. Ronan Blackthorn moved the way wounded animals move, slow, deliberate, conserving what remained. His left eye was swollen shut from the blow he took during capture, and dried blood had crusted along the ridge of his jaw like war paint he never asked for. His shoulders were broad but stooped now, carrying something heavier than iron. Every few steps, he turned his head just enough to check behind him, to make sure the boy was still there, still breathing, still standing. "Eyes forward!" the lead guard barked. He was a thick-necked man named Harsk, with scars on his knuckles that told their own stories. "You don't get to look at him anymore." Ronan said nothing. He kept walking, but his jaw tightened, and the muscles in his neck corded like bridge cables under tension. They crossed the courtyard and entered the main hall through a side passage that smelled of mildew and old stone. The corridor was narrow enough that the guards had to walk single file, their armor scraping the walls on both sides. Torches guttered in iron brackets, casting shadows that leaped and twisted like living things. The boy stumbled once, caught himself, stumbled again. One of the guards grabbed his collar and hauled him upright without a word. The throne room opened before them like the mouth of something vast and hungry. It was built to intimidate. Pillars of black granite rose 50 feet to a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. Banners hung from iron rods. The sigil of the Voss dynasty, a crowned fist gripping a broken sword. The floor was polished obsidian, so dark it seemed to swallow the torchlight rather than reflect it. And at the far end, raised on a platform of layered stone, sat the Iron Throne itself. King Kalen Voss did not look like a man who had been woken in the middle of the night. He sat with the stillness of someone who had been waiting. His armor was ceremonial but functional. Black steel plate over dark leather, with no ornamentation except the dynasty's crest pressed into the chest piece. His hair was cropped close to the skull, streaked with gray at the temples, and his face had the quality of something carved rather than born. Sharp angles, deep-set eyes the color of wet slate, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten the mechanics of smiling a long time ago. He was 43 years old, and he had been king for 12 of those years. Before that, he had been a warlord. Before that, a soldier. Before that, a boy not much older than the one now being dragged across his floor. But nobody remembered that version of Kalen Voss. He had made sure of it. "Bring them closer," the king said. His voice carried without effort, the way a blade carries, clean and final. The guard shoved Ronan to his knees 10 feet from the throne. The chains hit the floor with a sound like bones breaking. The boy was pushed down beside him, and this time he did make a sound, a small involuntary gasp, the kind a body makes when fear finally wins the war against pride. Ronan's head snapped toward the boy. "Easy," he murmured. "I'm right here." Silence. Kalen's gaze moved between the two prisoners the way a hawk studies the ground before diving. Ronan Blackthorn, also known as the Grey Wolf, also known as the Butcher of Heron's Crossing. I never liked that last one, Ronan said. His voice was rough, shredded from days without water. Wasn't even my best work. A guard stepped forward and struck him across the mouth with a gauntleted fist. Ronan's head rocked sideways. He spat blood onto the obsidian floor and straightened slowly, the way a man does when he knows there will be more. Kaelin watched this without expression. You've evaded my hunters for 6 years, burned 3 outposts, killed 9 of my soldiers, freed 24 prisoners from the labor camps at Duskwall. 12. What? 12 soldiers. Ronan lifted his head. His one good eye found the king's face and held it. If you're going to list my sins, get the count right. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes violence. Heavy, pressurized, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. Every guard in the room shifted their weight. The boy pressed closer to Ronan's side, his small body trembling against the chains. Kaelin leaned forward on his throne. The movement was slight, barely an inch, but it changed the geometry of the entire room. You're not in a position to correct me. And yet here I am, correcting you. The king studied him. There was something behind those slate-colored eyes. Not anger exactly, but the kind of cold calculation that precedes a decision already made. He had learned long ago that rage was a luxury. Rage made you predictable. What made you dangerous was the ability to feel nothing at all while deciding someone's fate. Who is the boy? Kaelin asked. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ronan's body changed, a subtle stiffening of the spine, a tightening around the jaw, the kind of involuntary response that no amount of training can fully suppress. He knew Kaelin saw it. He knew it was already too late to pretend the question meant nothing. Nobody, Ronan said. A stray, I picked up. You expect me to believe that the most wanted man in my kingdom spent 6 years on the run with a child he found by accident? Stranger things have happened. Name one. A butcher's son sitting on a stolen throne. The guard moved to strike again, but Kaelin raised one finger. The guard froze. The king's eyes had not left Ronan's face. You're trying to make me angry, Kaelin said. You want me to lose my temper and execute you quickly. A clean death. A soldier's exit. He paused. I'm not going to give you that. Ronan's jaw worked. Something shifted behind his bruised face. Not fear, but the recognition that the man across from him understood the game as well as he did. Kaelin turned his attention to the boy. The child flinched under the weight of the royal gaze, as if it had physical mass, as if those cold eyes could press down on him like a hand on his chest. What is your name? The king asked. The boy opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Ronan. Don't look at him, Kaelin said. Look at me. I asked you a question. Elias, the boy whispered. Elias what? Just Elias. Nobody is just anything. Everyone comes from somewhere. Who was your mother? The boy's chin trembled. I don't know. She died when I was small. And your father? Elias looked at Ronan again. This time, something passed between them. A current of understanding too deep for words, the kind of silent communication that only exists between people who have shared hunger and cold, and the particular terror of being hunted. He's right here, the boy said. Kaelin's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it, like tectonic plates moving beneath a mountain range. He looked at Ronan. Ronan looked back. And in that exchange, that wordless collision of 2 men across 10 feet of polished black stone, the temperature in the room dropped. Interesting, the king said, and then he said nothing else for a very long time. The court advisor, Lord Maranthulo, materialized from the shadows along the east wall like a man who had been bred specifically for the purpose of standing in shadows. He was thin to the point of appearing skeletal, with a narrow face and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging, calculating. His robes were the deep crimson of the administrative class, and his hands were clasped in front of him in a posture of practiced humility that fooled absolutely nobody who had watched him operate for more than a week. Your Majesty, Thule said, his voice like silk drawn across a blade. The prisoner's bloodline has been a matter of concern for the council since his capture. The Blackthorn lineage traces back to the Ashford Rebellion. If any heir remains, I know the history, Kalen cut him off. I lived it. Of course, my king, I merely suggest that the boy represents a complication. A complication, Kalen repeated the word as if tasting it, testing it for poison. The Ashford loyalists are scattered but not extinct. A child of that bloodline, even a rumored one, becomes a rallying point, a symbol. Thule paused, letting the word settle. Symbols are more dangerous than armies, Your Majesty. Armies can be defeated. Symbols endure. Ronan's chains rattled as he shifted on his knees. The boy is not a symbol. He's a child. He's 7 years old and he's terrified and he has done nothing to you or your kingdom. Every weed was once a seed, Thule said, without looking at him. And every tyrant was once a boy, Ronan shot back. Should we have killed yours when we had the chance? The guard struck him again. This time Ronan went down hard, his cheekbone cracking against the obsidian floor. The boy cried out, a raw animal sound, and lunged toward him, but the chains pulled tight and yanked him backward. He fell on his side, gasping, the rope biting deeper into his wrists. Stop! Kalen's voice was quiet, but it cut through the chaos like a wire through flesh. The guards froze. The room went silent except for the sound of Ronan's labored breathing and the boy's strangled sobs. The king stood. It was a slow, deliberate movement, unfolding from the throne like something mechanical being activated. He descended the 3 steps from the platform and crossed the floor until he stood directly over the prisoners. Up close, the details of his face became clearer. The scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, the network of fine lines around his eyes, the way his skin had the weathered quality of leather left too long in the sun. He looked down at the boy. Elias stared up at him, tears cutting channels through the dirt on his face. Something flickered in Kalen's eyes. A crack in the armor, so brief that anyone standing more than 5 feet away would have missed it entirely. But Ronan saw it. From his position on the floor, his one good eye fixed on the king's face, Ronan saw it. That microsecond of something that looked almost like recognition, almost like pain, almost like the ghost of a memory that had been buried so deep it should have rotted away years ago. Then it was gone. The wall came back up. The face hardened. The king became the king again. Lord Thule, Kalen said, prepare the execution for dawn. Both of them, Your Majesty? Both of them. Ronan's head came up off the floor. He's a child. He's a threat. He's 7 years old. He can barely read his own name. What threat does he pose to a kingdom with 10,000 soldiers? The threat is not what he is. The threat is what he could become. Kalen turned back toward the throne. Take them to the cells. Separate them. The guards moved forward. Ronan fought, not with any hope of escape, but with the desperate, futile violence of a man watching the only thing he has left being torn away. They hit him until he stopped fighting, until his body sagged in the chains, and his head hung forward and blood dripped from his mouth onto the floor in a steady metronomic rhythm. The boy screamed Ronan's name as they dragged him in the opposite direction. The sound echoed off the granite pillars and filled the throne room like something alive, a living, breathing thing made of terror and loss and the particular helplessness of a child who understands for the first time that the adults in charge do not care whether he lives or dies. The sound followed Kalen back to his throne. He sat down. He gripped the armrests until his knuckles went white. He stared at the blood on the floor. And for the first time in 12 years, the king of the Iron Dominion could not stop his hands from shaking. The archives were 3 levels below the throne room, buried in the guts of the keep like a secret the building was trying to digest. The air down there was cold and damp, thick with the smell of old paper and lamp oil, and something faintly mineral, like stone sweating underground. The corridors were narrow and lit only at intervals, so that walking through them meant passing through alternating pools of light and darkness, each transition a small rehearsal for something larger. Lady Seraphine Vale moved through the archive the way a surgeon moves through an operating room, with precision, economy, and the grim awareness that a single misplaced hand could mean catastrophe. She was 40 years old, lean in the way that women who forget to eat become lean, with ink-stained fingers and reading spectacles perched permanently on a nose that had been broken once and never set properly. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and her robes were the muted gray of the archival class, the color of people who were meant to be overlooked. She had not been overlooked in 12 years of service to the crown. She had simply allowed people to believe she had been. The news of Ronan Blackthorn's capture had reached the archives before it reached the court. Information always moved fastest through the building's lowest levels, carried by servants and clerks, and the kind of people who survived by knowing things before their masters did. Seraphine had heard the name and felt something shift in the back of her mind. A piece of a puzzle she had been assembling in secret for years. A puzzle she had told herself she would never need to complete. Now she needed to complete it. She pulled a key from the chain around her neck and unlocked a cabinet that was not listed on any inventory. Inside, behind rows of tax ledgers and census records, was a false panel. Behind the panel was a box. Inside the box were letters. Seraphine laid them on the table and stared at them the way a soldier stares at a weapon he hoped he would never have to use. There were 14 letters in total. 7 were written in a hand she recognized. The king's. Not the formal practice script of royal correspondence, but a different hand entirely. Looser. Younger. The handwriting of a man who had not yet learned to be careful with every mark he made on the world. The other 7 were written in a hand she did not recognize. A woman's hand. Small, precise, with the kind of deliberate clarity that comes from someone who learned to write late in life and treated each letter like a small act of defiance. She opened the first one. Read it. Opened the second. The third. By the fourth, her hands were trembling. The letters told a story that was not in any official record. A story of a young commander stationed at the frontier during the Civil War. A village healer who treated his wounds when his own surgeons were dead. A relationship that grew in the margins of violence, in stolen hours between battles, in a stone cottage at the edge of a forest that no longer existed. The woman's name was Marin. Not a noble name. Not a name that appeared in any court register or bloodline archive. A nothing name. A nobody name. The kind of name that empires are built to erase. But Marin had written 7 letters to a man she called by a name he no longer used. And in the last letter, Som, dated weeks before she vanished from every record, she wrote 4 words that changed everything Seraphine thought she knew about the King of the Iron Dominion. 4 words. Seraphine closed her eyes. She pressed her fingertips against them until she saw stars. She took 3 slow breaths and forced herself to think clearly, to separate the weight of what she had just read from the practical reality of what she needed to do next. The execution was set for dawn. Dawn was 5 hours away. 5 hours to verify what these letters implied. 5 hours to build a case strong enough that a king who had spent 12 years killing anyone who challenged his authority would have no choice but to listen. She gathered the letters. She locked the cabinet. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her knees protesting, her lungs burning, her mind already 3 steps ahead of her body. In the holding cells, the air was worse, thick with sweat and rust, and the particular stench of fear, which has a smell all its own, something acrid and animal, that the body produces when it understands death is not abstract anymore. The cells were carved from the same black stone as the throne room, but down here there was no polished surface, no grand architecture, just raw rock and iron bars and the sound of water dripping from somewhere unseen. Ronan sat on the floor of his cell with his back against the wall and his eyes closed. His face was a map of violence, the swollen eye, the split lip, the bruise blooming across his cheekbone in shades of purple and black that had not been invented yet. His hands rested on his knees, palms up, the chains pooled in his lap like a sleeping animal. He was not sleeping. He was listening. 2 cells down, he could hear the boy breathing, fast, shallow breaths, the kind that comes from someone fighting hard against panic. Every few minutes, the breathing would hitch, as if Elias were about to cry. And then it would steady again, as if he had pulled himself back from the edge through some force of will that no child his age should have needed to develop. 6 years, Ronan thought. 6 years of running, of hiding, of sleeping in ditches and eating whatever they could steal or trap. 6 years of teaching the boy to read by firelight, to recognize edible roots, to stay quiet when the soldiers came. 6 years of building something that looked nothing like a normal life but had, in its own broken way, become the only thing in the world that mattered. The cell door at the end of the corridor opened. Footsteps. Not the heavy tread of guards, but something lighter, more deliberate. Ronan opened his one good eye. Seraphine stood on the other side of the bars. She held a leather satchel against her chest with both arms, the way a mother holds a child, and her face had the expression of someone who has just jumped off a cliff and has not yet reached the bottom. "Ronan Blackthorne," she said. "Lady Vale." His voice was flat. "Come to catalog the condemned?" "I've come to ask you a question, and I need the truth. Not the version you've rehearsed, not the version you told the king. The actual truth." "I've got about 5 hours of truth left. Use them wisely." Seraphine pulled the letters from the satchel. She held them up so the torchlight caught the paper, so Ronan could see the handwriting, could see the yellowed edges and the wax seals and the particular shade of ink that had not been manufactured in 7 years. Something happened to Ronan's face. It was like watching a dam crack, not all at once, but in stages. First the muscles around his mouth tightened, then his nostrils flared, then his one good eye went wide, then narrow, then wide again. His breathing changed, his hands curled into fists in his lap, the chains pulling taut. "Where did you get those?" His voice had changed too. The flat, sardonic tone was gone. What replaced it was raw, stripped of every defense mechanism, every layer of performance, every wall he had built between himself and the world. The Royal Archive, hidden behind false records. Seraphine paused. "Marin, the village healer. Tell me about her." Ronan stared at the letters. His jaw worked, the muscles bunching and releasing, bunching and releasing. A man chewing on words he had sworn never to speak. "She was my sister," he said. The corridor went quiet. Even the dripping water seemed to stop. "Your sister," Seraphine repeated. "My older sister. By 4 years." Ronan closed his eye. When he opened it again, it was glassy. "She left the village when the war came south. I was fighting in the marshes with what was left of the Ashford militia. She went north, found work as a healer near the front lines. That's where she met him." "The king." "He wasn't the king then. He was just a soldier. A good one," she said. "The kind who carried the wounded back instead of leaving them. The kind who shared his rations when everyone else was hoarding." Ronan laughed, and the sound was broken glass. "Hard to believe, looking at what he became." "She wrote to him," Seraphine said. 7 letters. She told me. She told me she was with child and that the father was a commander in the Iron Legion. She told me she loved him. She told me—" His voice cracked. He breathed through it, dragged himself back from the edge the way his nephew did 2 cells down. "She told me he loved her too." "What happened?" "The war ended. Voss took the capital. They put a crown on his head and a wall around his heart, and suddenly the village healer who had warmed his bed was a liability. Not a person. Not a lover. A liability." Ronan's voice was bitter, concentrated, like poison distilled to its purest form. "She came back to me. 8 months along. Terrified. She said he didn't know. She said she never told him about the child. I believed her then. I'm not sure I believe her now. The boy was born. In my house. In the dead of winter. She bled too much. I couldn't stop it." His voice dropped to a whisper. "She made me promise. She said the boy could never know who his father was. She said the crown would eat him alive. She said the only safety was in being nobody." He looked up at Seraphine. "She died 3 days later. I buried her under the oak tree behind my house, and I took the boy, and I ran." "You ran for 6 years. Every day, every single day, because the men who came looking were not sent by the king. They were sent by the people around the king, the advisors, the lords, the ones who had built their power on the assumption that Kalen Voss would die without an heir and the crown would pass to their chosen puppet." Ronan's chains rattled as his fist tightened. They knew. Someone found out about the child, and they wanted him dead before the king ever learned he existed. Seraphine felt the blood drain from her face. "Lord Thule. I don't know names. I know boots in the dark and swords in the doorway, and the sound of a child screaming while I kill men I've never met to keep him breathing one more night." They stared at each other through the bars. The torchlight flickered. Somewhere in the corridor, a rat moved along the wall with the quiet confidence of something that knew it would outlast them all. "The king ordered him executed," Seraphine said. "Both of you, at dawn." "I know. He's going to kill his own son." Ronan's face twisted. The word landed like a blow, and for a moment his composure shattered completely, his mouth pulling into a grimace that was half grief and half rage, the expression of a man who has spent 6 years carrying a weight he was never supposed to carry and has finally hit the floor. "Then stop him," Ronan said. "You have the letters. You have the proof. Stop him." "I need more than letters. I need verification, blood records, birth registries, something he cannot dismiss as forgery." "Then find it. You've got 5 hours. That boy has done nothing wrong except exist. He didn't choose his blood. He didn't choose his father. He didn't choose any of this." Ronan pressed his face against the bars. "And neither did I." Seraphine turned and walked toward the stairs. Behind her, she heard Ronan's voice one more time, quieter now, barely above a breath, the words falling like stones into deep water. "Elias. His mother named him Elias. It means the one who survives." The stairs felt steeper on the way back up. Seraphine moved through the keep like a woman being chased by something only she could see. The corridors blurred around her. Stone walls, torch brackets. The occasional guard who stepped aside without question because the archivist had long ago earned the right to be anywhere at any hour. She climbed past the holding level, past the throne room level, past the residential quarters where the court slept in rooms that smelled of lavender and ignorance. She reached the records hall on the 4th level and let herself in with a second key. The room was vast, floor to ceiling with shelved ledgers, the accumulated bureaucratic output of a dynasty that believed documentation was a form of immortality. Birth records, death records, marriage registries, land grants, military commissions. Every life in the Iron Dominion reduced to ink on paper, filed and forgotten. She pulled the military records for the year of the Civil War. Troop deployments. Garrison assignments. She found what she was looking for within 20 minutes. Commander Kalen Voss, assigned to the northern frontier, stationed at a forward camp 6 miles from a village called Thornfield. Thornfield. Where the healer lived. Where the letters were written. Where a boy was conceived in the margins of a war that destroyed everything except the one thing it should have. She pulled the birth registry for that village. The pages were water damaged, the ink faded, but the entry was there. A child born in winter. Mother listed as Marin. Father listed as unknown. The village clerk's initials. A date that matched. 3 hours left. She needed one more piece. She found it in the last place she looked. The royal physician's private records, stored in a locked case that required a third key, and the knowledge of a hidden latch that she had discovered by accident 3 years ago while cataloging a collection of expired medical licenses. The physician's log for the year of the Civil War contained a single entry that should never have existed. A note, written in the cramped hand of a man who knew he was recording something dangerous. A blood sample taken from Commander Voss during treatment for a battlefield wound, and next to it, in different ink, added later, a comparison notation. A second sample. A child's sample. Collected by a military surgeon at the frontier camp and sent to the capital for archival purposes, which was a bureaucrat's way of saying someone wanted proof and someone else wanted to bury it. The samples matched. Seraphine sat in the records hall surrounded by the paper skeleton of an empire and understood that she was holding a bomb in her hands. The kind of bomb that does not destroy buildings but destroys the stories that hold buildings up. The kind that rewrites history not by adding new chapters but by revealing the ones that were ripped out. She organized the evidence, the letters, the deployment records, the birth registry, the physician's log. She placed them in the satchel in the order they would need to be presented: chronological, logical, undeniable. She rehearsed the argument in her head. She anticipated the objections. She prepared for the possibility that the king would simply kill her too and burn the evidence and go on being the man he had decided to be. That was the risk. That was always the risk of truth. Not that it wouldn't be heard, but that it would be heard and rejected anyway, because the lie had become load-bearing, and removing it would bring down everything built on top of it. 1 hour until dawn. Seraphine stood up. She straightened her robes, she pressed the satchel against her chest, and she walked toward the throne room where a king was preparing to kill a son he did not know he had, while 2 corridors away, a man who had spent 6 years running out of love sat in chains listening to a boy breathe in the dark and knowing that every breath might be the last one he would ever hear. The execution platform stood in the center of the main courtyard, assembled during the night by carpenters who did their work in silence, because silence was what the crown demanded. The wood was old and dark, stained with the memory of previous mornings like this one, and the block at its center had a groove worn smooth by the weight of necks that no longer existed. Dawn was a thin gray line on the eastern wall. The courtyard filled slowly, the way water fills a basin. Nobles first, then officers, then the household staff who were required to witness as a reminder that the crown's justice was absolute and its mercy was a privilege that could be revoked at any time. They stood in rows, their breath visible in the cold morning air, their faces carefully arranged into expressions of appropriate solemnity. Kalen stood on the raised platform at the north end of the courtyard, armored and rigid. He had not slept. He had not changed clothes. He had not done anything in the hours since the prisoners were taken away, except sit in his private chamber and stare at a wall and think about a boy's eyes. Dark, wide, terrified. And the way those eyes had looked at him, as if they were searching for something behind his face. He did not think about why that gaze had unsettled him. He could not afford to think about that. A king who examined his own doubts was a king who hesitated, and a king who hesitated was a dead king walking. The prisoners were brought out. Ronan walked under his own power, though it cost him. His face had swelled further overnight, and his gait had the careful, measured quality of a man navigating a floor made of broken glass. He kept his eyes forward. He did not look at the platform. He did not look at the block. He looked at the boy. Elias was carried, not because he could not walk, but because his legs had stopped working. Locked rigid by a terror so complete that his body had simply shut down the parts it considered non-essential for the basic function of staying alive. A guard held him under each arm, his feet dragging across the cobblestones, his face white as parchment. "Ronan!" The boy's voice was barely there, a thread of sound in the cold air. "Ronan, I'm scared." "I know." Ronan's voice was steady, impossibly steady, considering. "Look at me. Just look at me." "I don't want to die." "I know. Look at me, Elias, right here. Focus on my voice." "Why are they doing this?" Ronan swallowed. The answer to that question was the heaviest thing he had ever carried. Heavier than the chains, heavier than 6 years of running, heavier than his sister's body in his arms on the last morning of her life. Because the truth was simple and monstrous, and the boy deserved to hear it even though hearing it would help nothing. "Because they're afraid," Ronan said, "and afraid people do terrible things." The guards brought them to the platform. Ronan climbed the steps. The boy was carried up behind him. The executioner stood to one side, hooded, hands resting on the shaft of an axe that had been sharpened that morning with the same casual efficiency a cook uses to sharpen a kitchen knife. Kalen raised his hand. The courtyard went silent, the kind of silence that has weight and texture and taste, metallic, like blood held behind the teeth. "Ronan Blackthorn," the king said. His voice filled the courtyard without strain. "You have been found guilty of treason against the Iron Dominion. The sentence is death." Ronan stood straight. He met the king's eyes across 15 feet of cold morning air, and in his face was something that Kalen had not seen in a very long time. Not hatred, not defiance, but pity. The quiet, devastating pity of a man who knows a truth the other man does not. "You should ask yourself," Ronan said, loud enough for the courtyard to hear, "why your own advisors worked so hard to make sure I never stood trial, why they wanted me killed in the field, why they sent hunters instead of magistrates." He paused. "Ask yourself what they're afraid you'll learn." "Enough." Kalen's hand dropped. "Proceed." The executioner stepped forward. A guard forced Ronan to his knees. The block waited. The boy screamed, a sound that split the morning like an axe through timber. And then, from the far end of the courtyard, cutting through the scream and the silence and the iron certainty of a king's judgment, came a voice that should not have been there. "Stop!" Every head turned. Seraphine Vale stood in the courtyard entrance, her gray robes billowing in the dawn wind, her face flushed from running, a leather satchel clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind her, the first rays of sunlight broke across the eastern wall and caught the edges of the papers she pulled from the bag. Old papers, yellowed papers, papers that smelled of buried years and broken promises. "Your Majesty," she called, and her voice did not waver, though her hands shook so violently that the papers rattled like dry leaves in a storm. "Before you proceed, there is something you must see, something that changes everything." Kaelin stared at her. The executioner hesitated, blade half raised. The courtyard held its breath, and on the platform, still on his knees, Ronan Blackthorn closed his one good eye and whispered something too quiet for anyone to hear, a name or a prayer, or simply the sound of a man who has carried a secret for so long that releasing it feels less like relief and more like dying. The blade hung in the air, the sun crept higher, the boy shook in his chains, and the archivist walked toward the king with the truth in her hands, knowing that the next 60 seconds would either save 2 lives or end 3. The paper shook in Seraphine's hands like living things trying to escape. She crossed the courtyard in long, uneven strides, her boots slapping the wet cobblestones, her breath coming in clouds that dissolved against the dawn light. Every noble in the yard turned to watch her. Every guard shifted weight. The executioner held the blade overhead, frozen in that terrible half-swing, arms locked, waiting for an order that had not come. Kaelin's face was carved from the same stone as his keep. "Lady Vale, you are interrupting a royal execution." "I am aware of that, Your Majesty." "Then you understand the penalty for what you're doing." "I do." "And you're doing it anyway." "I am." The silence that followed was a living thing with teeth. Seraphine could feel it pressing against her chest, feel the weight of 400 eyes, and the particular gravity that surrounds a king whose authority has just been challenged in public. She had calculated this moment 100 times on her way up the stairs. She had weighed the variables, measured the risks, plotted every possible response the way a general plots troop movements before a battle. And she had arrived at the same conclusion every time. The only way to stop a king from making an irreversible mistake was to make the alternative more terrifying than the mistake itself. She mounted the first step of the execution platform. A guard moved to block her. She looked at him with the flat, certain gaze of a woman who has decided that fear is no longer a factor in her calculations, and the guard hesitated just long enough for her to take the second step. "Your Majesty, I have served the archive for 12 years. In that time, I have never once brought a matter directly to the throne. I have never once interrupted state proceedings. I have never once asked you to look at something you did not wish to see." She held up the satchel. "I am asking now." "The sentence has been pronounced. The law is clear." "The law is only as clear as the facts it rests on, and the facts you were given are wrong." That word, wrong, hit the courtyard like a hammer blow. The nobles shifted. Lord Thule, standing at the edge of the platform in his crimson robes, took a single step forward. His narrow face had gone the color of old wax, and his hands, usually so carefully clasped, hung at his sides with the fingers slightly curled, the posture of a man preparing to catch something falling. "Your Majesty," Thule said, his voice smooth and urgent, "the archivist is clearly overwrought. The strain of late hours and sensitive documents can produce—" "Let her speak." Thule's mouth closed, his jaw tightened, something moved behind his eyes, fast, calculating, the rapid-fire assessment of a man whose carefully constructed world has just developed a crack in its foundation. Kaelin descended from the viewing platform and crossed to the execution stage. Up close, Seraphine could see what the distance had hidden. The shadows under his eyes, the taut cords in his neck, the almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand that he controlled by pressing his fist against his thigh. He had not slept. She filed that information away the way she filed everything, quickly, precisely, in a place where it could be retrieved when needed. "You have 60 seconds, Kaelin said. "I need more than 60 seconds. "You have 60 seconds, Lady Vale. Use them or leave this courtyard." Seraphine opened the satchel. She pulled the first document, the military deployment record, and held it up. Northern Frontier, year of the Civil War. Commander Kalen Voss, stationed at a forward camp 6 miles from Thornfield Village. Something shifted in the king's face. Not much. A tightening around the eyes. A slight change in the angle of his jaw. The kind of micro-expression that most people would miss entirely, but that Seraphine had spent 12 years learning to read the way a sailor reads weather. "That is not a secret," Kalen said. "Every soldier in the Iron Legion served at the frontier. But not every soldier at the frontier exchanged letters with a village healer named Marin." The crack widened. Seraphine saw it happen in real time. The dilation of his pupils, the sudden stillness of his breathing, the way his weight shifted backward by half an inch, as if the name had struck him physically. He covered it fast. 12 years of kingship had given him the ability to rebuild his walls almost as quickly as they fell. But almost was not the same as completely, and in that half-second gap, Seraphine saw everything she needed to see. He remembered. He remembered all of it. "Where did you get that name?" His voice had dropped. Not in volume, but in register. Lower, rougher, stripped of the performative authority he used in public. This was the voice underneath, the one he used when no one was listening. "From your letters, Your Majesty, 7 of them, written in your hand, hidden in the royal archive behind false records that someone placed there to ensure they would never be found. Those records are sealed. They were sealed by someone who wanted them buried, not by you." Kalen's eyes moved to Thule. The Lord Advisor met his gaze and held it, but Seraphine watched his throat move, a convulsive swallow, the kind the body produces when the brain is generating a response and the throat is trying to keep up. "Your Majesty, I have no knowledge of any sealed—" "I didn't ask you." Kalen's voice was quiet, dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes an avalanche. "Lady Vale? Continue." Seraphine pulled the second document. "Birth registry, Thornfield Village, a male child born in winter, mother listed as Marin, father listed as unknown." She pulled the third. "Royal Physician's Log, a blood sample taken from Commander Voss during treatment for a battlefield wound. A second sample, a child's, collected by a military surgeon and sent to the capital for comparison." She held both documents side by side. "The samples match." The courtyard had gone so silent that Seraphine could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the wind moving across the battlements. She could hear the creak of the executioner's leather gloves as his grip shifted on the axe handle. Kalen stared at the documents. His face was doing something she had never seen it do before. It was fighting itself. The king's mask struggling against whatever was underneath it, the two forces grinding against each other like tectonic plates, and in the friction between them, something was building. Pressure, heat, the kind of energy that either becomes an earthquake or gets buried so deep it poisons the groundwater for generations. "What are you telling me?" His voice was barely audible. "I think you already know." "Say it." "The boy." Seraphine turned and pointed at Elias, who stood on the platform between two guards, his face white, his body trembling, his dark eyes fixed on the exchange with the desperate concentration of a child who understands that his life is being argued over in words he cannot follow. "The boy is not Ronan Blackthorn's son. He is the son of Marin of Thornfield, and Marin of Thornfield was carrying your child when she disappeared from every record in this kingdom. The word you're detonated in the silence like a charge buried in stone." Kalen did not move, did not speak, did not blink. He stood on the execution platform in the gray dawn light, armored and rigid, and for a span of time that felt geological. 5 seconds, 10, 15. He simply existed in the space between the man he had been and the man this information required him to become. Then he turned and looked at the boy. Elias looked back, and the resemblance that Seraphine had seen in the letters, that she had suspected in the birth records, that she had confirmed in the physician's log, the resemblance hit the courtyard like a physical force. The same deep-set eyes, the same sharp angle of the jaw, the same way of holding the head slightly tilted when confronting something they did not understand. Father and son, separated by 36 years and an ocean of blood and politics, standing 15 feet apart on a platform built for killing, seeing each other for the first time through the lens of a truth that had been stolen from both of them. Kalen's hand came up. Not a command, not a gesture of authority. It came up the way a drowning man's hand comes up, reflexive, desperate, reaching for something solid in a world that had just liquefied beneath his feet. Ronan. His voice cracked on the name. The king's voice, cracking. The sound was so wrong, so fundamentally incongruent with everything the courtyard had been trained to expect, that several of the nobles physically stepped backward. Is this true? Ronan, still on his knees before the block, raised his battered head. He looked at the king with that one good eye, and in it was a complex mixture of grief and vindication and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has finally been allowed to set down a weight he has been carrying for years. His mother was my sister, Ronan said. She made me swear to protect him, to keep him hidden, to keep him alive. His voice hardened. Not from you, from the men standing around you, the ones who knew he existed and wanted him dead before you ever found out. Every head in the courtyard turned toward the nobles' section. Lord Thule had not moved. His face had achieved a stillness that went beyond composure into something closer to rigor, the frozen expression of a man whose mind is moving at full speed while his body has shut down all non-essential functions. That is a desperate accusation from a condemned traitor, Thule said. His voice was steady. Almost. Your Majesty, this woman has produced a collection of old papers that prove nothing. Birth registries can be forged, letters can be fabricated, blood samples from 20 years ago can be verified. Seraphine cut him off without looking at him. The physician who collected the samples is dead, but his apprentice is not. He lives in the lower city. He kept copies. As insurance. Thule's composure slipped, just a fraction. A twitch at the corner of his left eye, a slight parting of his lips, the kind of involuntary response that the body produces when the brain receives information it was not prepared for. Seraphine watched it happen and felt the grim satisfaction of a hunter watching a trap close. Your Majesty, Thule said, and now there was an edge to his voice, the first crack in the silk. Surely you cannot take the word of an archivist and a condemned rebel over the council of men who have served you faithfully for faithfully. Kalen said the word like he was biting it in half. You want to talk to me about faith, about loyalty. He turned to face Thule, and whatever Thule saw in the king's eyes made him take a step backward, an involuntary retreat, the body overriding the brain's insistence on holding ground. You knew. I did not. You knew. You knew about the woman. You knew about the child. You buried the records. You sent the hunters. Kalen's voice was rising now, not in volume, but in density, each word heavier than the last, compressing the air between them until breathing felt like work. You sat in my council for 12 years and watched me hunt this man across my own kingdom, knowing that the boy he carried was mine. Your Majesty, I acted in the interest of the crown. The child's existence threatened the succession protocols. The bloodline question would have destabilized. You let me order the execution of my own son. The words landed in the courtyard like a blade hitting the block. Final. Irreversible. The kind of statement that, once spoken aloud, can never be taken back or softened or explained away. Thule opened his mouth. No sound came out. Kalen turned away from him. He walked across the platform to where Elias stood between the guards. The boy flinched at his approach, a full-body recoil, the instinct of a child who has learned that powerful men mean pain. The guards held him in place. Kalen raised his hand again, and this time the gesture was unmistakable. He was reaching for the boy's face. He stopped himself. His hand hung in the air between them, trembling. The king of the Iron Dominion, the man who had crushed rebellions and burned cities and built an empire on the bones of his enemies, stood on an execution platform with his hand shaking in the cold morning air because he could not bring himself to touch a 7-year-old boy's cheek. Elias. His voice was something no one in the courtyard had ever heard before. Not the king's voice, not the commander's voice. Something older. Something that had been locked in a room for 20 years and was only now remembering how to speak. Do you know who I am? The boy's chin trembled. You're the king. Do you know what that means? It means you decide who lives and who dies. Kalen flinched. The accuracy of the statement, delivered in that small, terrified voice, cut deeper than any blade in the executioner's collection. "Yes," he said. "It means that." He lowered his hand. He turned to the courtyard. "Release them. Both of them. Now." The guards looked at each other, looked at Thule, looked back at the king. "Now." The chains came off Ronan first. He collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated damage of 3 days of captivity. A guard moved to help him up. Ronan shoved the hand away and stood on his own, swaying but upright, his jaw set against the pain. The ropes came off Elias. The boy stood frozen for a moment, unable to process the sudden absence of restraint, and then he broke. He ran across the platform and threw himself against Ronan's legs, wrapping his arms around the man's thighs, burying his face in the filthy fabric of his shirt. Ronan's hand came down on the boy's head. Gently, so gently, the calloused fingers of a fighter performing the most delicate act he knew. Kalen watched them. His face was a battlefield, emotions crossing it like armies, each one visible for a fraction of a second before the next one overran it. Recognition, regret, fury, loss. And underneath all of it, something raw and primal and ancient, the biological imperative of a father seeing his child, truly seeing him for the first time. He turned to the captain of the guard. "Arrest Lord Thule." The courtyard erupted. The noble section dissolved into chaos. Voices shouting, bodies pressing forward and backward simultaneously, the sudden frantic energy of a herd that has spotted a predator in its midst. Thule's allies surged toward him. Thule's enemies surged toward the king. The guards drew steel. Thule himself had not moved. He stood at the edge of the platform, watching his world disintegrate with the peculiar calm of a man who has always known this day was possible and has already calculated his next 3 moves. His eyes found Seraphine's across the chaos, and in them she saw not fear, not surprise, but a cold, measuring intelligence that was already adapting, already reconfiguring, already looking for the angle that would turn even this catastrophe to his advantage. "Captain," Thule said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise, "I would like to note that I go willingly. I have nothing to hide. I look forward to presenting my account of events to the full council." He extended his wrists. "I trust His Majesty will ensure a fair process." The chains closed around his wrists. He did not flinch. He walked between the guards with the measured stride of a man leaving a dinner party, not a crime scene. And as he passed Seraphine, he leaned close enough that only she could hear and whispered 5 words that turned her blood to ice. "You have no idea what's coming." The cells beneath Voss Keep had been built for common traders, men who stole grain or forged tax stamps or spoke the wrong name in the wrong tavern. They were not built for a man like Marin Thule. But Thule sat on the stone bench as if he had designed the room himself, his back straight, his crimson robes folded neatly across his knees, his wrists resting in the chains with the relaxed posture of a man waiting for a meal he has already ordered. Kalen stood on the other side of the bars and felt the wrongness of it. The geometry was correct. The king on one side, the prisoner on the other. But the power was inverted. Thule's calm was not the calm of defeat. It was the calm of a man holding cards that have not yet been played. "You have one chance," Kalen said. "Tell me everything." "Everything is a very large word, Your Majesty. Shall I start with the weather?" "You buried evidence that I had a son. You sent men to kill a child. My child." "I sent men to protect a kingdom." Thule tilted his head, studying the king the way a physician studies a wound, calculating depth and severity. "You were 23 when you took the throne. You had just won a civil war. The Ashford loyalists were scattered, but not destroyed. The noble houses were circling like wolves, waiting for the lead animal to stumble. And into that fragile moment, you had managed to produce an heir with a village healer of no name, no house, no political value whatsoever." He paused. "What would you have had me do? Announce it? Hold a ceremony? Invite the same men who tried to kill you 6 months earlier to celebrate the birth of a half-common bastard who would have become the most valuable hostage in the kingdom before he could walk?" Kalen's jaw tightened. The logic was clean. That was the problem with Thule. His logic was always clean. It moved in straight lines from premise to conclusion, each step rational, each decision defensible, each betrayal wearing the mask of necessity. It was the kind of thinking that built empires and hollowed them out from the inside at the same time. "You didn't make that choice for the kingdom," Kaelin said. "You made it for yourself. A king without an heir is a king whose succession can be controlled, and you plan to do the controlling." Thula's expression did not change, but his breathing shifted. A fractional deepening, the kind of adjustment the body makes when the brain recognizes it has been seen through and begins rerouting to an alternative strategy. "I have served you faithfully for 12 years. You have served yourself for 12 years. You just did it from my shadow. Every advisor serves himself, Your Majesty. The honest ones admit it. The dangerous ones pretend otherwise." Thule leaned forward. The chains pulled taut. "But let me ask you this. What changes now? You have a son. Congratulations. A 7-year-old boy raised in ditches by a fugitive. A boy who cannot read, who flinches when adults raise their voices, who has no training, no education, no understanding of what a crown means or what it costs. You plan to put this child on the Iron Throne? I plan to give him what was stolen from him. And in doing so, you will destroy what I spent 12 years building. The alliances, the trade agreements, the succession pacts with the border houses. Every lord in this kingdom has positioned his family based on the assumption that Voss dies without an heir. You're about to tell them that assumption was a lie, and you expect them to smile and bow and accept a street child as their future king." Kaelin said nothing. The silence between them was not empty. It was loaded, pressurized, filled with the accumulated weight of 12 years of trust that had just been revealed as something else entirely. He had relied on this man, had eaten at the same table, shared military intelligence, delegated the management of an empire's internal architecture to a mind he believed was working in parallel with his own. And the whole time, beneath the loyalty and the crimson robes and the carefully clasped hands, Thule had been building a different structure entirely, one designed to outlast the king it served. That was the thing about power that nobody told you when they put the crown on your head. The enemies who would destroy you rarely came from outside the walls. They came from the chair next to yours. They spoke softly. They agreed with you in public. They poured your wine and read your correspondence and knew your schedule better than you did. And by the time you understood what they were, they had already become load-bearing. Remove them, and the whole thing shook. Kaelin turned and walked out of the cell block without another word. The corridors of Voss Keep felt different now. The same stone walls, the same torch brackets, the same guards standing at their posts with the mechanical discipline of men trained to be furniture. But the air had changed. It tasted like something had been unsealed, a room that had been locked for years, its contents finally exposed to oxygen, beginning the slow process of decomposition that reveals what things are actually made of underneath their surfaces. Seraphine was waiting in the war room. She had laid the evidence across the table in the same chronological order she had presented it in the courtyard. The deployment records, the letters, the birth registry, the physician's log, but she had added new documents pulled from the archive in the hours since the execution was halted. Financial records, communication logs, travel authorizations bearing Thula's personal seal. "How deep does it go?" Kaelin asked. "Deep." Seraphine's face was drawn, the skin tight across her cheekbones, the exhaustion of 2 sleepless nights written in the hollows under her eyes. Thule didn't act alone. He couldn't have. The physician who collected the blood samples was found dead 6 months after filing his report. Official cause was fever, but his apprentice, the one who kept copies, told me the physician had been healthy the week before. No symptoms, no warning. Murdered. Almost certainly. And the military surgeon who sent the child's sample to the capital was reassigned to a garrison on the southern border 3 weeks later. He died in a raid that his commanding officer described as routine. The commanding officer at the time was Lord Gavrin Holt. Holt serves on my council. He does. And his appointment was recommended by Lord Thule. Kaelin pressed both palms flat against the table. The wood was old oak, scarred and stained, the kind of surface that had absorbed the plans and arguments and miscalculations of generations of men who believed they were in control of things that were in fact controlling them. He stared at the documents and felt something shifting inside his chest. Not the hot, sharp anger of the courtyard, but something colder and heavier. The slow, grinding realization that the kingdom he thought he ruled was a different organism than the one that actually existed. That the architecture of power he believed he had built was in fact a set designed to look like a building, with nothing behind the walls except scaffolding and the quiet industry of men who understood that the most effective prisons are the ones the prisoner believes he designed himself. Who else? His voice was flat, stripped of everything except the need to know. Seraphine pulled a sheet of parchment from the bottom of the stack. It contained a list of names, 7 names. All of them men who sat in his council, commanded his armies, managed his treasuries, administered his justice. Men he had elevated from minor nobility because Thula had recommended them. Men whose careers had been shaped by the same invisible hand that had buried his son in a forgotten village and tried to keep him there permanently. These are the ones I can confirm from the financial records. There may be more. The network was designed to be compartmentalized. Each member knew only his immediate role, not the full architecture. Classic intelligence structure. Thule built it the way you would build a spy ring. Inside my own government. Inside your own government. Kalen studied the names. Each one was a face he could picture, a voice he could hear, a hand he had shaken, a shoulder he had gripped in the battlefield fellowship that only soldiers understood. And every one of those memories was now contaminated. Not destroyed exactly, but poisoned, the way a well is poisoned when a body is dropped into it. You could still see the water. It still looked like water, but drinking it would kill you. The door opened. A guard entered, and behind him came Ronan Blackthorn. Ronan had been cleaned up, but the damage was still visible. The bruises had deepened overnight into shades that did not exist in any painter's palette, and he moved with the stiff, careful gait of a man whose body was running on reserves that would not last much longer. But his one open eye was sharp, and when he looked at Kalen, there was none of the deference that the king's presence usually commanded, just the flat, level gaze of one man assessing another. "Sit down," Kalen said. "I'll stand." The silence stretched. 2 men in a stone room separated by 20 years of diverging roads that had started at the same crossroads. One had taken power, the other had taken a child. And now the distance between those choices had collapsed to nothing, and they stood in the wreckage trying to determine if there was anything worth salvaging. "How much did Marin tell you?" Kalen asked. "Enough." "Did she tell you why she left?" Ronan's jaw tightened. "She said you wouldn't remember her. She said you had already become someone else by the time the war ended. She said the boy who sat with her in that cottage and talked about building a different kind of kingdom had been replaced by a man who understood that kingdoms are not built. They are taken." The words hit Kalen in a place he did not know was still vulnerable. He had believed, truly believed, that he had calcified completely, that the process of becoming king had sealed off every soft place, every exposed nerve, every point of entry where the past could reach in and find him. But this man standing in front of him with his broken face and his ruined eye was a living conduit to a version of himself that he had spent 2 decades trying to kill, and the version would not die. "She was wrong," Kalen said. "I would have remembered her." "You had 20 years to find out. You didn't look." "I didn't know there was anything to look for." "Because Thulu made sure you didn't." Ronan's voice was steady, but something underneath it was shaking, a deep structural vibration, the sound of a man who has swallowed his rage for so long that it has become part of his skeleton. "Your advisor buried my sister, not in the ground, in paper. He erased her from every record. He killed the people who knew about her. He sent soldiers to the village and burned the cottage where your son was born. And then he sent hunters after me year after year because I was the last thread connecting that boy to the truth." "I didn't send those hunters." "No, you just built the machine that sent them. You created the system. You appointed the men. You looked the other way when your advisors told you not to ask questions about how the kingdom's security was maintained." Ronan stepped forward. A guard moved to intercept. Kalen waved him off. "You didn't know about Elias, I believe that. But you chose not to know things. You chose comfort over scrutiny. And my sister died because of that choice. And her son grew up eating roots in the forest because of that choice. and I spent 6 years sleeping with one eye open because of that choice. Kalen did not defend himself. He could have. He could have pointed to the wars he had fought, the borders he had secured, the famine he had prevented in the 3rd year of his reign, the infrastructure he had built, the order he had imposed on a kingdom that was burning when he inherited it. He could have argued that leadership requires delegation, that no king can personally verify every action taken in his name, that the alternative to trust is paralysis, and the alternative to paralysis is the kind of micromanagement that destroys both the man and the institution. He could have said all of that. Instead, he stood in the war room and let the accusation settle on his shoulders the way snow settles on stone, quietly, completely, changing the shape of the thing it covers. "Where's the boy now?" he asked. "In the guest quarters on the 3rd level. 2 guards at the door. He hasn't eaten. He hasn't slept." Ronan paused. "He asked me if the king was going to come back and finish what he started." Something moved across Kalen's face. Quick, violent, instantly suppressed, like a creature darting beneath the surface of dark water. He turned away from Ronan and braced himself against the table, his arms locked, his head bowed, his breathing controlled with the deliberate rhythm of a man who is choosing not to break. A messenger entered the room without knocking. He was young, pale, out of breath. "Your Majesty, Captain Aldrich sends word from the lower cells. Lord Thule is requesting an audience with the full council. He claims he has evidence of a larger conspiracy and is willing to testify." Seraphine and Ronan exchanged a look. In that glance, between 2 people who had met only hours ago, an entire conversation took place. Suspicion, assessment, the shared understanding that a trapped animal is most dangerous in the moment it appears to surrender. "He's playing something," Seraphine said. "Of course he's playing something." Kalen straightened. His face had reassembled itself. The cracks were still there, but they had been rearranged into a new configuration. Not the rigid mask of a king performing certainty, but something harder, something more aware. The face of a man who has finally understood the actual shape of the game he is playing. Thule doesn't offer information unless the information serves him. If he wants to testify, it's because testimony gives him a stage. And a stage gives him access to the men on that list. "Then don't give him the stage," Ronan said. "I have to." Kalen looked at the list of names on the table. 7 men. 7 faces he had trusted. 7 knives that had been pointed at his son's throat for 7 years while he sat on his throne and believed the room was safe. If I arrest them without due process, I become the tyrant Thule will claim I am. The other houses will see a king purging his advisors on the word of a rebel and an archivist, and they will conclude that no one close to the crown is safe. That's the opening Thule is counting on. He wants chaos. Chaos is cover. "So what do you do?" Seraphine asked. "I let him testify. In front of the full council. In front of witnesses from every noble house." Kalen's voice had the quality of a blade being sharpened, each word slightly more precise than the last. "And I make sure the evidence is presented before he has a chance to reshape the narrative." He turned to Seraphine. "How long to compile a complete case? Financial records, communication logs, testimony from the physician's apprentice, military transfer orders, everything connected to those 7 names?" 12 hours. If I don't sleep." "Don't sleep." He turned to Ronan. "The boy trusts you. Stay with him. Don't leave his side. And if anyone approaches those quarters without my direct authorization, you have my permission to treat them as a threat." Ronan studied the king's face for a long time, looking for something, testing something. And whatever he found there, sincerity or calculation, or the complicated alloy of both that defines every man who has ever held power, it was enough to make him nod. "One condition," Ronan said. "When this is over, no matter how it ends, the boy gets a choice. He's not a chess piece. He's not a symbol. He doesn't owe you a dynasty because you share his blood. He gets to decide what his life looks like." Kalen opened his mouth to answer, but the messenger was back, and this time his face was not just pale. It was the color of a man who has seen something he will never be able to unsee. "Your Majesty, the lower cells, Lord Thule is—" He swallowed. "Lord Thule is gone." The room went cold. "Gone." Kalen's voice was a blade laid flat. "The guards found the cell empty 10 minutes ago. The chains were still locked, The door was still sealed, but the cell has a drainage channel that connects to the old sewer system. The grate had been removed, recently. The stonework around it was fresh. Someone had prepared the exit in advance. The realization hit Kaylin like a wall falling. Not just the escape, the preparation. The drainage channel had not been modified tonight. It had been modified days ago, weeks ago, maybe months. Thule had always known this moment was possible. He had built an exit into his own prison before he ever needed to use it. The same way he had built exits into everything, so contingencies nested inside contingencies. Escape routes threaded through the architecture of a kingdom he had spent 12 years hollowing out from the inside. Seraphine's face had gone white. If he reaches the border houses before we do, he won't need to reach them. Kaylin's voice was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. He only needs to reach the 7 men on that list, the ones still in my keep, the ones who just watched me halt an execution, arrest their leader, and reveal that I have a hidden heir. Right now, every one of those men is calculating whether it is safer to stay loyal or to finish what Thule started. He paused. And Thule just sent them their answer. The torches guttered. Somewhere deep in the walls of Voss Keep, in the ancient passages and forgotten corridors that networked the fortress like veins through a body, a man who had spent 12 years learning every secret the building held was moving through the dark with the unhurried confidence of someone who had planned for this night long before it arrived. Kaylin looked at the list of names. Then he looked at the door. Then he looked at Ronan, and for the first time since the courtyard, the 2 men understood each other completely. Not as king and rebel, not as ruler and subject, but as 2 men standing on the same side of a line that had just been redrawn in the dark by someone who knew exactly where both of them were standing. Get to the boy, Kaylin said. Now. Ronan was already running. Ronan took the stairs 3 at a time, his broken body screaming against every impact, his lungs burning with the specific fire of a man who has not slept or eaten in 3 days and is now sprinting through a stone fortress on adrenaline and the kind of fear that rewires the nervous system into something more primitive and more efficient than the thing it replaces. 3rd level, guest quarters. 2 guards at the door. That was what Kaylin had said. 2 guards. He rounded the corner and saw one. The guard was on the floor, sitting against the wall with his legs splayed out in front of him and his hand pressed against the side of his neck where blood was pulsing through his fingers in dark, rhythmic jets. His eyes were open, glassy, fixed on the ceiling with the bewildered expression of a man who is watching his own life leave his body and cannot quite reconcile the speed of the departure. The 2nd guard was gone. The door to the guest quarters was open. Ronan did not slow down. He pulled the fallen guard's sword from its sheath without breaking stride and went through the door low, the blade extended, his weight shifting forward onto the balls of his feet in the instinctive combat stance that 6 years of running had engraved into his muscle memory, the way a river engraves a canyon, slowly, permanently, through sheer relentless repetition. The room was dark except for a single candle on the table. The bed was empty. The blankets had been thrown back, and a child's boot lay on the floor beside the frame, knocked loose in a struggle. Elias! His voice came out ragged. Elias. A sound from the adjoining chamber. A muffled cry. The specific frequency of a child trying to scream through a hand clamped over his mouth. Ronan kicked the door open. A man stood in the center of the room with Elias pressed against his chest and a knife held across the boy's throat. The man wore the uniform of the royal household staff, a servant or someone dressed as one, and his face had the tight, feral expression of a man who is performing an act he was not fully prepared for. His hand was shaking. The knife trembled against Elias's skin. "Stop," the man said. "Come closer," and I cut him. Ronan stopped. His body wanted to move forward. Every fiber, every nerve, every drop of blood was screaming at him to close the distance and end this. But his mind overrode the impulse with the cold calculation that had kept both of them alive for 6 years. The knife was too close. The angle was wrong. Any sudden movement and the blade would open the boy's throat before Ronan could cover half the distance. "You don't want to do this," Ronan said. His voice was steady, impossibly steady. The steadiness of a man who has learned that panic is a contagion, and the only way to stop it is to become the stillest thing in the room. Lord Thule sent orders. The boy doesn't leave this keep alive. Thule is gone. He ran. He left you here to do his killing and take his punishment. You understand that, right? You're a loose end. The moment that knife touches the boy's skin, you become the man who murdered a prince, and the king will not let you see another sunrise. The man's eyes flickered, doubt, moving across his face like a shadow across water, but the knife stayed where it was, and behind it, Elias's dark eyes were locked on Ronan with the absolute, unwavering focus of a child who has placed every remaining shred of trust in a single human being and is waiting for that human being to make the world make sense again. I don't have a choice, the man said. If I don't do this, Thule's people find me, find my family. You always have a choice. Right now in this room, you have a choice. Put the knife down, and I give you my word. I will protect you the same way I protect him. Your word means nothing. You're a condemned traitor. I'm a man who has spent 6 years keeping this boy alive against every force your master could send. If my word means nothing, explain how we're both still breathing. The man's arm tightened. Elias whimpered. A thin line of red appeared on the boy's neck where the blade pressed too hard. Not deep, not dangerous, but enough to send a bolt of something electric through Ronan's nervous system, something that short-circuited every rational thought and replaced it with a single crystalline imperative that had no words, only velocity. He moved. Not forward, sideways. He threw the sword, not at the man but at the wall beside him, a clattering distraction that pulled the man's eyes left for a fraction of a second. And in that fraction, Ronan covered the distance with a lateral lunge that brought him inside the knife's arc. His left hand caught the man's wrist and wrenched it outward while his right arm hooked around Elias and tore the boy free. The man slashed. The blade caught Ronan across the forearm, opening a gash from wrist to elbow that immediately began pouring blood in a warm, steady stream. Ronan did not feel it. He would feel it later, when the adrenaline receded and the nerve endings remembered they existed. But right now his body had made a decision about priorities, and pain was not among them. He shoved Elias behind him and drove his forehead into the man's face. The impact was wet and final. The man staggered backward, his nose flattened, blood erupting across his lips and chin. Ronan followed, caught the knife hand again, bent the wrist past its breaking point. Something snapped, a sound like a green branch giving way, and the knife clattered to the floor. The man went down. Ronan went down on top of him, his good hand finding the man's throat, his fingers closing with the deliberate mechanical pressure of someone tightening a vise. The man clawed at his forearm, kicked, bucked. The movements grew weaker. Ronan, Elias's voice, small, terrified. Ronan, stop! He stopped. He released the man's throat and sat back on his heels, breathing hard, his injured arm dripping blood onto the stone floor in a pattern that looked random, but was actually metronomic. 1 drop per heartbeat, the body's own clock counting down toward a reckoning that could not be postponed much longer. The man on the floor gasped and coughed and curled onto his side. Ronan turned to Elias. The boy stood against the wall, his face streaked with tears, his small hands balled into fists at his sides. The cut on his neck was superficial, a scratch, nothing more. But the blood on his skin was the loudest thing in the room. "Are you hurt?" Ronan asked. Elias shook his head. His chin was trembling so violently that his teeth clicked together. Ronan pulled the boy against his chest and held him. His blood soaked into the child's shirt. His arms shook from exhaustion and blood loss and the subsiding tide of a violence so intense it had temporarily turned him into something he did not recognize. He pressed his face into the boy's hair and breathed and felt the small, frantic heartbeat against his own chest. Fast, erratic, the heartbeat of a hunted thing. And he made a decision. No more running. 6 years he had kept this child alive by staying 1 step ahead, by sleeping in caves and crossing rivers at night, and never stopping long enough to build anything that could be taken away. And every year the margin had gotten thinner, the hunters had gotten closer, the boy had gotten older and harder to hide and more aware that the life they were living was not a life at all, but a prolonged act of escape that had no destination. Running was a strategy that consumed itself. It burned the future to fuel the present, and left nothing behind except footprints that filled with water and disappeared. No more. He tore a strip from the bedsheet and wrapped it around his forearm, pulling the fabric tight with his teeth. The bleeding slowed. It did not stop, but it slowed enough that the room stopped tilting every time he moved his head. He picked up the sword from where it had fallen. He walked to the door. He looked both ways down the corridor. Footsteps. Coming fast. Multiple sets moving in the coordinated rhythm of trained soldiers. Ronan shifted his weight and raised the blade and felt the specific clarity that descends on a human being when the range of possible outcomes has been reduced to two. Survive or don't. And the only variable left is the quality of the fight. Kalen came around the corner with 6 guards at his back. Their eyes met. Kalen's gaze dropped to the blood on Ronan's arm, to the sword in his hand, to the boy pressed against his leg. The king's face underwent a transformation that happened so fast it was like watching a chemical reaction. The rigid mask of authority dissolving into something raw and primal and urgent. "Where is the man?" Kalen asked. "On the floor, alive. Thule sent him." Kalen pushed past Ronan into the room. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked at the blood. He looked at the overturned furniture and the knife and the thin red line on Elias's neck. And something happened to the king of the Iron Dominion that his court had never witnessed, and that the history books would later struggle to describe. His composure did not crack. It evaporated. It left his face the way heat leaves a body, all at once. And what remained was not the king but the father, and the father was not a man anyone in that corridor wanted to be standing near. "How many of them are inside the keep?" His voice was ash. "Unknown, Your Majesty." The guard captain, a broad man named Aldrich with 20 years of scars mapped across his knuckles. "We've confirmed 2 of the 7 names are no longer in their quarters, Lords Gavrin Holt and Sarek Dane. Their personal guards are also missing." "That's at least 20 men." "At least." Kalen turned to Ronan. The distance between them, the political distance, the historical distance, the distance between a king and the man he had ordered killed that morning, collapsed. What remained was a shared problem and the grim mathematics of a situation that was deteriorating faster than either of them could control. "You know this keep," Ronan said, "better than they do. I built half of it. Then you know where they'll go, where the choke points are, where a small force can hold against a larger one." Kalen's eyes narrowed. He was recalculating. Ronan could see it happening. The shift from political thinking to tactical thinking, the king becoming the soldier he had been before the crown, dusting off instincts that had been stored in a locked room for 12 years and finding them still sharp, still functional, still hungry. "The West Tower," Kalen said. "Single staircase, 1 entrance, stone walls 3 feet thick. If Holt and Dane are moving to consolidate, they'll try to take the armory first. It's on the ground floor of the West Wing. And if they take the armory, they arm their men and anyone else inside the keep sympathetic to Thule, which could be more than 20, could be 50. Thule has had 12 years to seed loyalists into every level of the household." Ronan absorbed this. 50 men. In a fortress designed to be impenetrable from the outside, which meant it was equally effective at containing a fight on the inside. Every corridor a kill zone, every doorway a potential ambush, every shadow a place where a knife could be waiting. "Captain Aldrich," Kalen said, "seal the main gates, no one in or out. Send riders to the garrison at Milford. I want reinforcements inside these walls by dawn, and pull every man you trust to the West Wing." "Every man I trust, Your Majesty?" The question hung in the air. Trust. The word had become a different kind of weapon in the last 12 hours. Not a shield, but a blade, and nobody was sure who was holding it. "Every man you would die for," Kalen said. "No one else." Aldrich nodded and moved. Kalen looked at Elias. The boy had not released his grip on Ronan's leg. His dark eyes, the king's eyes, the same shape, the same depth, the same capacity for seeing things that other people chose not to look at, stared up at the man who had ordered his death that morning and almost failed to prevent it tonight. "I'm going to make this right," Kalen said. The words were not a royal decree. They were not a political statement. They were the stammering, inadequate syllables of a man who has just discovered that the most important thing in his life has been within arm's reach for hours, and he has spent every one of those hours failing to protect it. Elias said nothing. He pressed his face into Ronan's hip and closed his eyes. Kaelin turned to Ronan. "Can you fight?" Ronan looked at his wounded arm. The makeshift bandage was already soaked through, the fabric dark and heavy with blood that was running faster than the tourniquet could contain. His vision was starting to narrow at the edges. Not dramatically, not yet, but with the subtle dimming that a man who has lost blood before recognizes as the opening act of a performance that ends with the floor rushing up to meet his face. "I can fight," he said. "You're losing blood." "I've lost blood before." "Not like this. Not like anything before." "That seems to be the theme tonight." Kaelin studied him, measured him the way a commander measures a soldier, not by what they say they can do, but by what their body reveals when their mouth stops moving. The tremor in the hands, the dilation of the pupils, the slight sway in the stance that indicates the inner ear is beginning to lose its argument with gravity. "You'll stay with the boy, in the tower. I'll send a physician." "I'm not sitting in a tower while—" "That is not a request." Kaelin's voice hardened, not the king's voice, the father's voice. A voice Ronan had not heard from this man before. Heavy with something that went deeper than authority, something that lived in the bones rather than the crown. "You are the only person in this keep that the boy trusts. If something happens to you, I lose him. Not to a blade, not to an assassin. I lose him inside himself, in the place children go when every adult who was supposed to protect them has failed. I cannot reach him there. I haven't earned that. You have." Ronan stared at the king, and in that stare was the grudging, painful recognition that the man standing in front of him, the man who had ordered his execution, who had built the machine that killed his sister, who had spent 12 years ruling a kingdom constructed on a buried lie, was capable of seeing the truth when it was placed directly in front of his face. Not because he was noble, not because he was wise, but because the alternative, continuing to look away, had finally become more expensive than looking. "If you die in there," Ronan said, "I'm taking him and we disappear. Forever. No kingdom, no throne, no dynasty. Just him and me, and whatever's left of the road. If I die in there, that's exactly what I want you to do." They looked at each other for 3 heartbeats. Then Kaelin pulled a short blade from his belt and pressed it into Ronan's good hand. "For the tower," the king said, "in case I'm wrong about the walls." He turned and walked toward the west wing. 6 guards fell in behind him. Their boots echoed on the stone, growing fainter with each step, until the corridor swallowed them and the silence returned. Heavier now, thicker, weighted with the specific density of things that have been set in motion and cannot be recalled. Ronan lifted Elias into his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing, a collection of bones and fear and a heartbeat that he could feel through the child's back, fast and thin, a bird trapped in a cage made of ribs. "Are we running again?" Elias whispered. "No." Ronan started up the tower stairs. Each step sent a bolt of white pain through his injured arm and a corresponding wave of dizziness that he fought through by counting. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. The way he had taught the boy to count through thunderstorms, giving the mind a task so the fear had nowhere to sit. "No more running." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe." "Is there anywhere safe?" Ronan did not answer. He climbed. Below them, in the west wing of Voss Keep, the sound of steel meeting steel echoed through the corridors as Kaelin's loyalists met the first wave of Thula's men at the armory door. The clash was ugly and close-quartered. No room for formation, no space for strategy, just the brutal, compressed violence of men fighting in a stone hallway wide enough for 2 abreast, where every swing carried the risk of hitting the wall, and every step forward meant stepping over someone who was no longer standing. Kaelin fought at the front, not because a king should fight at the front, every military advisor he had ever employed would have told him otherwise, but because the men behind him needed to see that the man who wore the crown was willing to bleed for it. That was the currency of loyalty in a crisis, not words, not titles, not the abstract architecture of law and tradition. Blood. The willingness to stand in the same killing ground and take the same risks and trust the same armor and feel the same fear. He had forgotten how fear tasted. 12 years behind a throne, surrounded by guards, insulated from physical danger by layers of protocol and architecture and the specific kind of distance that power creates between a man and the consequences of his decisions. He had forgotten the metallic tang of it on the back of his tongue, the way it sharpened the edges of everything, vision, hearing, the perception of time itself, which slowed and stretched until each second became a landscape he could navigate. A man came at him from the left, household guard, wearing the Holt family crest on his shoulder plate. Kalen blocked the strike, felt the impact travel up his arm and into his shoulder, stepped inside the man's reach, and drove his blade through the gap between breastplate and pauldron. The man fell. Kalen stepped over him without looking down because looking down was a luxury and luxury was a corpse maker. "Push forward," he shouted. "Take the armory door." They pushed. 3 men fell on both sides in the space of 10 seconds, and the corridor floor became a surface that required careful navigation. Slippery with blood, cluttered with bodies, the footing treacherous in the way that all honest violence is treacherous, unglamorous, a matter of angles and traction and the brute physics of steel against flesh. They reached the armory door. Aldrich drove his shoulder into it, and the wood splintered inward. Inside, Gavin Holt stood behind a table piled with weapons, his own sword drawn, his personal guard arrayed in a semicircle around him. His face had the cornered, desperate expression of a man who has bet everything on a play that is not working and is now calculating the diminishing returns of resistance. "Holt!" Kalen's voice filled the room. He stood in the doorway, covered in blood. Some his, most not. His chest heaving, his blade dripping, his face wearing an expression that was not rage and not triumph, but the cold, exhausted recognition that the thing he was doing right now was the thing he should have been doing all along. Put down the sword. And then what? Your dungeon? Your executioner? Your cooperation? Your testimony? The truth about what Thule built inside my walls? Thule is gone. Whatever he built dies with his departure. Nothing built on 12 years of deception dies that easily. You know that. I know that. The only question is whether you help me dismantle it from inside or whether I tear it down from outside with you underneath it. Holt's sword arm wavered. His guards looked at each other. The mathematics of the room were shifting. Kalen's men at the door, the corridor behind them cleared, the armory a dead end with no second exit. Whatever Thule had promised, whatever future he had sold to these men, it was a future that required Thule to be present, and Thule was not present. He was somewhere in the dark outside the keep's walls, running with the same efficiency he had applied to everything else, leaving behind the men who had trusted him the way he had left behind every other tool that had outlived its usefulness. Holt's sword hit the floor. His guards followed. Steel clattered against stone. Hands went up. The fight was over. But Kalen did not feel victory. He felt the absence of the thing that had been sustaining him, the adrenaline, the forward momentum, the clarity of combat. And in its place came the crushing weight of everything that was waiting on the other side of the violence. A kingdom to rebuild, a government to purge, a son to know. Aldrich approached. "Your Majesty, Lord Dane is unaccounted for. He wasn't in the armory. He wasn't in his quarters." Kalen closed his eyes. 1 second. 2. When he opened them, the exhaustion was still there, but it had been pushed below the surface, compressed into a layer beneath the operational awareness that was already scanning for the next threat, the next variable, the next knife he had not yet seen. "The tower," he said. "Dane knows about the tower." And then he was running, the way Ronan had run an hour ago. Not like a king, not like a commander, but like a father, tearing through the corridors of his own fortress with his blood-wet sword in his hand and his heart slamming against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his teeth, racing toward a stone staircase where a wounded man and a 7-year-old boy waited behind a door that was only as strong as the man defending it. The sound of his boots on the stone was the sound of a man who has finally understood that everything he built means nothing if the one thing he failed to protect is taken from him in the last hour of the longest night of his life. And somewhere above him in the tower, a door handle turned. The door handle turned and Ronan was already there. He stood 3 feet back from the entrance with the short blade Kaelin had given him, held low in his good hand, his wounded arm pressed against his ribs to slow the bleeding, his body positioned between the door and the corner of the room where Elias crouched behind an overturned table. The tower chamber was small and circular, lit by a single window slit that let in a thin blade of moonlight, and the air smelled of old dust and iron and the copper tang of Ronan's blood pooling on the stone beneath his feet. The door opened slowly, carefully. The way a man opens a door when he knows something with teeth is waiting on the other side. Lord Sarek Dane stepped into the room. He was a compact man, built close to the ground, with the dense utilitarian musculature of someone who had earned his rank through combat rather than politics. His sword was drawn. Behind him, 2 soldiers filled the stairwell, their faces half lit by the torch one of them carried. Dane's eyes found Ronan. Then they moved past him to the boy. Then they came back. He assessed the situation the way a professional assesses a situation, quickly, without sentiment, measuring distances and angles and the condition of the man standing between him and his objective. "You're half dead," Dane said. "Step aside." "Come find out which half." Dane did not smile, but something shifted in his expression. A flicker of respect, maybe, or the recognition that the man in front of him was not operating on logic, but on something older and less negotiable. "I have no quarrel with you, Blackthorn. You've already proven what you are. Walk out that door with whatever's left of your blood, and I'll tell them you fought and fell. Nobody will look for you." "And the boy?" "The boy is not your concern anymore." "The boy has been my only concern for 7 years. Try again." Dane's grip tightened on his sword. The torchlight caught the edge of the blade and threw a line of orange across the ceiling that wavered like a living thing. Behind Ronan, Elias made a sound. Not a word, not a cry, but a small exhalation that contained the entire vocabulary of a childhood spent learning that closed doors do not mean safety, and adult voices do not mean help. Ronan heard it. He heard it the way a tuning fork hears its own frequency, a resonance that bypassed the ears and went straight to the center of whatever kept him standing when his body had every reason to stop. "Last chance," Dane said, and stepped forward. Ronan met him at the threshold. The fight was short and ugly and nothing like the stories. Dane was rested, armed, trained, fighting with the mechanical competence of a man who had killed before, and found the process unremarkable. Ronan was bleeding, exhausted, wielding a short blade against a longsword, and operating on a fuel source that had no name in any language. The thing that lives in the space between a man and the child he has chosen, the force that makes the body do what the body cannot do, that overrides the limits of muscle and bone and blood volume with something that physicians cannot measure and philosophers cannot explain. He took the first strike on his blade and felt the impact shatter up through his wrist and into his shoulder. He gave ground. Dane pressed. The longsword came down in a diagonal cut that Ronan deflected at the cost of his balance. He staggered sideways, hit the wall, used the wall to push himself back into the path of the next swing. The blade caught him across the ribs. Not deep. Enough. He felt the heat of the cut and the wet warmth that followed and understood with the clinical detachment of a man who has been hurt many times that his body was running out of the materials it needed to keep functioning. He closed the distance. Inside the longsword's reach, where Dane's advantage in weapon length became a liability, and drove the short blade upward. Dane twisted. The blade missed his throat and caught the meat of his shoulder instead, sinking 3 inches into muscle before Ronan's grip failed, and the weapon stayed embedded as Dane reeled backward. They stood apart, both bleeding now, both breathing in the ragged, desperate rhythm of animals at the end of a chase. "You stubborn son of a—" Dane never finished the sentence. Kaelin came through the doorway like a force of weather. He hit the first soldier from behind, drove his sword through the man's back, ripped it free, and was on the second before the body reached the floor. The second soldier managed a half-turn before the king's blade opened his arm from shoulder to elbow, and a gauntleted fist sent him into the wall with a sound like a sack of grain hitting stone. Dane spun. Kaelin was already there. Their swords met once, twice, 3 times, the strikes percussive, explosive, each one carrying the full weight of a body behind it. Dane was good. Kaelin was better. Not because of skill, but because of something that skill cannot replicate. The specific gravity of a man who has just sprinted through his own fortress past the bodies of his own soldiers and arrived at a tower room to find his son's protector bleeding on the floor, and the last of Thule's assassins standing over him. He beat Dane's sword wide on the fourth exchange, stepped into the gap, and drove his pommel into the man's face. Dane dropped. Kaelin followed him down, one knee on his chest, the edge of his blade pressed against the soft tissue under Dane's jaw. Yield. Dane's eyes rolled. Blood bubbled from his split lip. He looked up at the king above him and saw what everyone saw when Kaelin Voss stopped performing and started existing. The raw, unmediated presence of a man who has built himself from nothing twice and is fully prepared to do it a third time if the world requires it. Yield, Dane said. The word came out thick, distorted by the blood in his mouth. His sword hand opened. The blade rattled against the stone. Kaelin did not move. He stayed on Dane's chest with the blade at his throat, and for a span of seconds that felt much longer, the room existed in a state of suspended violence. The kind of moment where a man's entire character is revealed not by what he does, but by what he chooses not to do, when every instinct is screaming at him to finish it. He pulled the blade back. He stood. He turned. Ronan was on the floor, propped against the wall, his face the color of wet ash. His shirt was soaked through. The arm wound, the rib wound, the accumulated damage of 3 days of violence pressed into a body that had been running on nothing but will for the last hour. His eye was open, fixed on Kaelin with the glassy focus of a man who is watching the world from a distance that is increasing with each heartbeat. Elias had left his hiding place. He was kneeling beside Ronan, his small hands pressed against the wound on Ronan's ribs, trying to stop the bleeding the way a child tries to stop water with his fingers, desperately, uselessly, with a determination that was heartbreaking in its inadequacy. "Don't go to sleep," Elias was saying. His voice was cracking. "You told me. You always told me. Don't go to sleep when you're hurt. Stay awake. Ronan, stay awake." Kaelin crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside them. His hands, the king's hands, the hands that had just disarmed a man and could have killed him, found the wound on Ronan's ribs and applied pressure with a precision that came not from kingship, but from the years before kingship, the years when he was a soldier who had packed wounds in the mud and held men together with his bare hands while the surgeons were busy dying. "Look at me," Kaelin said. "Blackthorn. Look at me." Ronan's eye drifted, found the king's face. A ghost of something crossed his features. Amusement, maybe, or the dark humor of a man who appreciates irony even when the irony is trying to kill him. "Hell of a night," Ronan murmured. "Don't talk. Save it. Physician won't make it in time. We both know that." "I said don't talk." "The boy—" "I know." "No, listen." Ronan's hand came up, slow, shaking, the fingers cold, and found Kaelin's wrist. The grip was weak but precise, the last expenditure of a man who is choosing very carefully where to spend what remains. He doesn't need a king. He needs a father. There's a difference. You understand me? He doesn't need decrees and thrones and the weight of a dynasty on his shoulders. He needs someone who sits with him when the nightmares come, someone who teaches him that strength isn't the fist. It's the hand that opens after. Kaelin's throat moved, his jaw tightened. His eyes, the same eyes as the boy's, the same depth, the same capacity for seeing, were bright with something that the torchlight could not fully explain. "I'll learn," Kaelin said. "You'll have to, because I won't be there to do it for you." "You're not dying. I won't allow it." Ronan laughed. The sound was wet, thin, threaded with pain. "You're a king, not a physician. Some things don't obey orders. This one does." "Kaelin." It was the first time Ronan had used the king's name, not the title, not the rank, the name, the one that belonged to a man before it belonged to a kingdom. "Promise me something. Anything. Don't turn him into you. Don't take what's soft in him and harden it, because you think the world requires it. The world eats hard men. It breaks them and uses the pieces. What survives, what actually endures, is the part that stays human. My sister knew that. She knew it better than either of us." The physician arrived 11 minutes later. 11 minutes that Kalen spent on his knees on a tower floor, with his hands pressed against a dying man's body, and his son pressed against his side, and the sounds of a fortress being secured, echoing up through the stone around them like the heartbeat of something vast and wounded, beginning the slow, uncertain process of healing. Ronan did not die. He came close enough that the physician's face told the story. The tight-lipped, grim expression of a man working at the outer edge of his skills with materials that were barely adequate, and a patient whose blood volume had dropped to levels that made consciousness a mathematical improbability. But the blade had missed the organs. The arm wound, though severe, had not severed the major vessels. And the body, that stubborn, battered, relentless body that had carried a child through 6 years of wilderness and violence and deprivation, refused to stop. They moved him to the royal quarters. Not the guest rooms, not the infirmary, but the king's own chambers, because Kalen understood that symbols matter, and the first symbol of the new order would be a reformed traitor lying in the king's bed with the king's physician attending him, and the king's son sleeping beside him with one small hand wrapped around the unconscious man's fingers. Kalen sat in a chair beside the bed and watched them. He sat there for hours, through the dawn and into the morning, while Aldrich and Seraphine managed the aftermath, the arrest of the remaining conspirators, the securing of the keep, the dispatch of riders to the border with descriptions of Thule and orders that made the consequences of sheltering him unambiguous. He sat and watched his son sleep, and watched the man who had saved his son breathe, and felt the specific weight of a debt that cannot be repaid with gold or titles, or any of the currencies that kings traditionally use to settle accounts. The debt was simpler than that, and heavier. It was the debt of a man who had almost killed the only two people in the world who had loved his child enough to die for him. The mother who bled out in a cottage, the uncle who bled out on a tower floor. Both of them had given everything for a boy that Kalen had not known existed, and both of them had done it without expecting anything in return, which was a form of courage that made military valor look like a costume. He thought about what Ronan had said. Don't turn him into you. The word sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable, pressing against the place where his certainty used to live. For 12 years he had operated on the assumption that he was the finished product, that the process of becoming king had been completed and the result was final, that the man who sat on the Iron Throne was the ultimate version of Kalen Voss, refined by fire and war and the relentless pressures of governance into something harder and more durable than the raw material he had started with. But sitting in that chair, watching his son's chest rise and fall with the slow rhythm of exhausted sleep, he understood that the finished product was a lie, that hardness was not strength, that the wall he had built around himself was not a fortress, but a cage. And the man inside it had been suffocating so slowly he had mistaken the loss of air for the acquisition of discipline. The boy stirred, his eyes opened, confused, unfocused, carrying the residue of dreams that Kalen could not imagine and was not sure he wanted to. The dark eyes found the king's face, and in them Kalen saw the one thing he had spent 12 years making sure no one ever showed him. Fear. His own son was afraid of him. That was the moment, not the courtyard, not the letters, not the physician's log or the blood samples or the political revelation that had upended his kingdom. This. A 7-year-old boy opening his eyes in a strange room and seeing the face of a man he had been taught to fear, and flinching. Elias, Kalen said. His voice was quiet, stripped of authority, stripped of everything except the raw, unpolished sound of a man trying to speak a language he has not used in 20 years. You don't have to be afraid of me. Ronan said kings always want something. Ronan was right. I want something. What? Time. Just time. I want to know what food you like. I want to know what makes you laugh. I want to sit in a room with you and not talk about kingdoms or thrones or bloodlines and just be in the same place. He paused. The words were coming hard, each one extracted from somewhere deep and defended. I've never done that before. I don't know how, but I want to learn, if you'll let me. Elias looked at him for a long time. The assessment in those small, dark eyes was thorough and merciless. The assessment of a child who has learned through experience that adults say things they do not mean. and the only reliable measure of a person is what they do when they think no one is watching. Ronan says you have to earn trust, that it doesn't come with a crown. Ronan is right about that too. Are you going to hurt him? No, never. Are you going to send us away? No. What if the other lords don't want me here? Then the other lords will learn to live with disappointment. Something shifted in the boy's face. Not trust. That would take months, maybe years, maybe the sustained application of daily consistency that is the only currency children accept. But something adjacent to trust, something that lived in the same neighborhood, the willingness to wait and see. I like roasted chestnuts, Elias said. Kaelin blinked. What? You asked what food I like. Ronan used to roast chestnuts when we could find them, on the fire at night. They pop if you don't cut them open first. He burned his fingers every time. A sound came out of Kaelin that he did not recognize. It took him a full second to identify it as laughter. Rusty, unused, the mechanism corroded from 12 years of disuse, but still functional. Still there. Still capable of making the sound that human beings make when something breaks through the armor and reaches the part of them that knows how to feel without calculation. I'll remember that, Kaelin said. Chestnuts. Cut them first. On the bed, Ronan's breathing had steadied. The physician had said he would need weeks to recover, maybe longer, and that the arm would never be fully right again. But he was alive. His chest rose and fell. His fingers twitched in his sleep, curling and uncurling in the unconscious rehearsal of a man who has spent 6 years gripping things too tightly and is only now, in the deepest rest he has had in years, beginning to learn how to let go. The weeks that followed were slow and strange, and filled with the particular discomfort of a kingdom rearranging itself around a truth it had not been designed to contain. The 7 conspirators were tried before the full council, with Seraphine presenting the evidence she had compiled with the relentless precision of a woman who understood that justice was not a feeling but a structure, and structures were only as strong as the documentation that supported them. 5 confessed. 2 maintained their innocence until the financial records and communication logs made innocence a mathematical impossibility. Thule was found at the border, 40 miles from the eastern crossing, hiding in a merchant caravan that had been paid in gold bearing the royal seal. He was brought back to Voss Keep in the same chains Ronan had worn, and the symmetry of that image, the advisor in the prisoner's irons, rippled through the kingdom with the force of a story that tells itself. He did not break during interrogation. He did not beg. He sat in his cell with the same composed stillness he had maintained throughout. And when the sentence was read, he looked at Kaelin with an expression that was not hatred and not remorse, but the flat, clinical evaluation of a man who is watching a chess game he can no longer influence and is simply cataloging the moves for future reference. There would be no future reference. The sentence was final. Ronan healed in the king's quarters, where Elias appointed himself chief medical officer and enforced a regimen of rest and nutrition that consisted mainly of roasted chestnuts and the firm directive that Ronan was not allowed to get out of bed until the boy decided he could. Ronan obeyed with a meekness that was entirely foreign to his character, and that he would later attribute to blood loss rather than the more accurate explanation, which was that a man who has spent 6 years being strong for a child will collapse the moment the child becomes strong enough to take a turn. Kaelin came every evening. He sat in the chair beside the bed and talked to his son, not about the kingdom, not about the future, not about the weight of the crown that would one day be his. About chestnuts. About the constellations visible through the tower window. About the way horses smell after rain. About the dog Elias had found in the woods 2 years ago and lost to a river crossing and still dreamed about on bad nights. Small things. Human things. The kind of things that a man learns to speak about when he finally understands that the measure of a life is not the territory it conquers, but the hands it learns to hold without crushing. The formal acknowledgement came on a Tuesday. Not a grand ceremony. Kaelin had wanted one, had been advised by the remaining council that spectacle was necessary to establish the succession in the minds of the noble houses. But Seraphine had quietly pointed out that a boy who flinches at loud voices would not benefit from trumpets and crowds. So it was done in the throne room, with a small assembly, and the crown prince was introduced not with a herald's shout, but with the king's own voice, steady and unhurried, speaking the boy's name into the vaulted silence as if he were learning to pronounce it for the first time. Elias stood beside the throne in new clothes that he kept touching with the bewildered expression of a child who has never worn anything that had not been previously worn by someone else. Ronan stood behind him, one arm still bandaged, his face a gallery of fading bruises, his posture carrying the particular tension of a man who is trying very hard to look comfortable in a room full of the kind of people he has spent his life avoiding. Kaelin named him Guardian of the Crown Prince, an official title with an official salary and official quarters and the official weight of the crown's full authority behind it. Ronan accepted the title with a nod that contained no ceremony and no deference, just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who understands that the thing he was already doing has now been given a name. Years passed. They do that. They pass with the relentless indifference of water flowing over stone, reshaping everything they touch so gradually that the change is only visible when you step back far enough to see the whole landscape at once. Elias grew, not just in height, but in the specific way that children grow when the ground beneath them stops shifting, steadily, confidently, with the unhurried expansion of a living thing that has finally found soil deep enough to root in. He learned to read in the library where Seraphine had first uncovered the truth of his existence. He learned to ride in the courtyard where he had nearly died. He learned to speak with authority in the same throne room where his father had sentenced him to death. And the irony of that was not lost on anyone, least of all on Kaelin, who watched his son grow into the space he had once tried to destroy, and understood that this, not the wars, not the borders, not the iron grip on a fractured kingdom, this was the thing that would survive him. Ronan never fully recovered the use of his left arm. He didn't seem to mind. He stayed in the keep, a permanent fixture in the hallways and training yards and dining halls, a man who moved through the architecture of power with the easy disregard of someone who has no interest in power itself, but an abiding interest in the people it touches. He taught Elias to track, to listen to silence, to read the weather in the behavior of birds, to understand that a man's character is not revealed in his victories, but in the moment immediately after his worst failure, when the world has stripped away every excuse and every costume, and the only thing left is the decision to stand up or stay down. And Kaelin, the king of the Iron Dominion, the man who had built a throne on blood and silence and spent 12 years believing that the throne was the point. He ruled differently after that night, not softer. The kingdom still required steel, still demanded difficult decisions and the willingness to make them. But the steel had been tempered by something it had not previously contained, an awareness that the structures a man builds are only as valuable as the people they protect. That power which exists for its own perpetuation is not power at all but addiction, and the withdrawal is a kingdom full of men like Thule, hollow, calculating, loyal to nothing except the architecture of their own advancement. He kept the letters. Marin's letters. He read them on quiet evenings in his private chamber, and each time he read them he found something new, a phrase he had missed, a detail he had overlooked, a glimpse of the man he had been before the crown devoured him, and the woman who had loved that man enough to protect his child from the thing he became. He did not sentimentalize her memory. He did not construct a retroactive romance out of what had been a brief, desperate, wartime connection between two people who were too young and too frightened to understand the weight of what they were creating. But he honored it. He let it exist in his memory without revision or excuse, and that was enough. That was the most honest thing he had ever done with a piece of his past. Elias grew into a man the kingdom did not expect. Not a conqueror, not a diplomat. Something harder to name and harder to fake. A leader who listened before he spoke, who admitted what he did not know, who treated the servants with the same respect he showed the lords because he had been both, and understood that the difference between them was circumstance, not character. The nobles who had feared the street child on the throne found themselves serving a prince who understood their world without being captured by it. And the common people who had never expected the crown to see them found themselves seen by a boy who had eaten their food and slept in their barns and knew their names. On the last page of the story, on a morning 10 years after the night that changed everything, Kaelin stood on the ramparts of Voss Keep and watched his son ride through the lower city with Ronan at his side. The boy, The man sat the horse easily, naturally, with the relaxed posture of someone who is not performing authority but inhabiting it. Beside him, Ronan rode with one hand on the reins and the other resting in his lap, the damaged arm carried without shame, a permanent record of the night he had stood between a child and a kingdom and refused to move. Kalen watched them until they disappeared around the corner of the merchant's quarter. Then he stood alone on the wall, with the wind pulling at his hair and the city spreading below him like a living map of everything he had built and broken and rebuilt. He thought about legacies. The word had always meant conquest to him, territory, treaties, the material evidence of a reign that would be catalogued and analyzed by historians who had never held a sword or buried a child or stood in a room where the truth was more dangerous than any weapon. But standing on that wall, watching the space where his son had been, he understood that legacy was something smaller and larger than territory. It was a boy who knew the sound of chestnuts popping on a fire. It was an uncle with a ruined arm who had never once complained about the price. It was a king who had learned, in the slowest and most painful way possible, that the hand that opens is stronger than the fist that closes. The wind blew, the city moved, the empire endured, and somewhere below the ramparts, in the streets his father had conquered and his son would inherit, Elias laughed at something Ronan said, a sound that carried up through the morning air and reached the king on his wall like a message delivered across a distance that no longer existed.